Thanks for reaching out, Emma, and yeah, glad to be here. So I thought that I would try something interesting. So when Emma reached out and said, hey, is there something you want to talk about? I thought that it could be interesting to be linking a concept to part of why I really like blockchain technologies in general. So in this talk, you won't necessarily be learning about different types of blockchain technology. Most people here know a lot about that already. This is more about having a different point of view about it that I find is quite useful. So overlaps in social and technological consent. So when you hear the word consent, we think of a couple different situations, and when you look it up, you also find a couple different applications. Lately, there's a lot of stuff about the social and sexual side of it. There's also legal and medical, so those are kind of go into more of the definitions, things that are a bit more official. And I'm going to apply it to tech and blockchain. So it sounds pretty simple when you first look at it, but there's actually a couple of facets of consent that are more dimensional and I find that are really interesting for applications in blockchain. So it all starts out with the environment necessary for consent, and I think that, yeah, let's start the story there. So it starts with Maslow's pyramids of needs. People raise their hand if they've seen this around. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, awesome. So, very basic kind of survival, wellness of people. So this is what the internet thinks it is. I found this image, it was really great. Kind of added a couple on there too. And then, this is what it actually is. So at the very bottom, you've got physiological, so the stuff that just as creatures, as basic monkeys, what we've needed since a really long time. Then it's the safety, as much physical as psychological, and kind of encompasses a whole bunch. Belonging and love, so once you're safe, once you know that nothing's going to eat you, what do? Well, you look to build relationships. And out of those relationships, once you've got kind of the maybe more personal side of things, maybe the more private things, then you looked for self-esteem within a bigger society, within a larger circle, public. And once you're there, well, you look for a self-actualization. So you're looking for, what is the one gem that kind of makes you you, and if you just plug it into society just correctly, then it'll kind of go exponential and everyone will love you. But also, everyone's kind of looking for those things that gives you purpose. So it's a lot about purpose as well. So looking at Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? So no stealing from the bottom to attain something that's higher up on the chain for yourself if you've already got all the rest figured out. And when you have something, well, it's kind of good to look at trying to pitch in a little bit to provide access to the ones, to people who are still trying to, meet those needs. Thing is, so within society, there's different people who are at different levels of these. So, and we do need the cross-pollination. It'd be really easy to say, well, let's all just, everyone who's in the middle there, concerned about relationships, only interact with people at that, concern as well, because that'll mean that, it'll be kind of more equal power dynamics, if you will. But we really do need the cross-pollination. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So, but, what does it look like when those asks start to meet? So you have, on the left over there, you have self-actualization or self-esteem concerns, if you will, that overlap with physiological safety. So if someone is wanting to get, let's say, a Mac computer produced out of something, and the other side, well, just kind of wants to eat. So it's more about the basic needs. So in this overlap, when that power dynamic happens, that's where the side that has a bit more power, if you're going to look at it, in a dichotomous way, which you don't need to, but it's interesting. That side has more responsibility. And they're individual, so what happens next? Well, I think that's where some technologies, such as blockchain technology, can be really interesting. So, we talk about blockchain, but we talk about decentralization with it. So this is kind of, you all know, the spirit behind blockchain. And I see it as reducing the possibilities and impacts of inevitable abuses of power. This is where some of the terminology starts to come in, and I find that it's really interesting. So I see it as, building consent boundaries within that. And maybe even building systems that work like controlled burns, so risk minimizations. So we've had, the forest fires in BC this summer, and they're not going away. Some talks have been going on since a little bit now. I think maybe, I'm aware of it for about 2 years now, but talking about experimenting with controlled burns where you burn certain areas and knowing that it will be happening later on, just to be able to minimize and control it when it actually goes full burn. It also makes me think of technologies that are very old. So I'm from New Brunswick. This is my little Acadian wahoo. Yeah, oh, nice, is there someone? And so, hey. And so these are les abattoirs, in English known as dikes. So I see these as, conditional consent. So it's a series of when, if, and then. It's looking at, you've got certain information that is allowed to go out and other information that is kept private. We all know what those types of transactions are like. And here's where it gets faceted. So here's when it gets interesting to me. So there are different types of consent. So when I started looking into it a bit more, who was saying what, the most interesting ones that I found and that kind of summed it up into different categories was implied consent, express consent, and dynamic consent. We'll go over them all, but the last two are the ones that also relate the most to informed consent, so having information in order to make a decision. So the first one is implied consent, and to me, it kind of likens the most to scraping the ocean floor in order to get your fish. It's gonna get, it might do the job, but it might do a lot of damage in doing so. So it's kind of best suited for things that you already know, established communication, and trusted players and territory. An advantage is definitely that it's low on time and energy, so it's a quick and easy way to do something. But it might not be good for any of the contrary of these situations. So if something is high risk, if there are higher repercussions, and the rest. So. Then there's express consent. And I see express consent being kind of more like, when they take those ice samples in the Arctic. So it's according to a clear set of circumstances. There's a delineated goal and a want, so there's something very precise that people are trying to get to. And it's very static, so it's a one point in time type of thing, and very determining. You're only going to be able to do certain things with this, but those things it might do really well. So they were pretty precise in saying, it's always written or it's always spoken. Be interesting if there was some version of interpretive dance of it. And then it's good for regulatory applications, stability and precision, and is very common in legal medical standards. last, and kind of my favorite, and I think the most applicable to blockchain technology, is dynamic consent. In my opinion, this is what we're all kind of building. I'll go over, there's a couple more as well, but so dynamic consent is iterative, and I kind of liken it to making a soup, right? So if you're just kind of making it up, you might have a recipe, so you can have foreseen it, you can have gotten ingredients, but you might be just kind of winging it a little bit too. It's in that iterativeness is to taste, you can adjust it. You know, if you have a guest and they happen to just really not like green beans, that's okay. You can have something else. And, you know, in that, so it's responsive and adaptable. The things that I find are pretty cool about it, so it's most like real life, right? Most things in real life, if you've got a project going on, it's going to have some flexibility, it's going to go back and forth in it. The process becomes important, so it's as much about an end goal as about a process in itself. And there's space for feedback and influencing of the process. So those are the three. And I found that they have some interesting implications for blockchain. The first reason is because so I guess these are more like problems in like the state of being, is that we are having more and more access to info, including identity and belonging. So those things are being accelerated. We have more and more access to these things. There's an uneven access to technologies and resources. So just because it's out there doesn't mean that it's going to change everyone's lives. And centralized systems do create a dependency and a fragility based on that system. I think that's something we're all trying to change. So blockchain can do better by bettering the environment necessary for consent. It can also be great for implementing dynamic consent, so putting it in action. And it logs express consent in a secure way. So let's look first at how it can better the environment necessary for consent. So I found a good example of this was decentralized mesh networks. So we know what these are, so you're able to relay information without the help of a third-party centralized router, for example. And within that, you strengthen the network, and even if it goes down, or even if it's just not there, then you're able to get that information across. And that's not about to stop getting important. So being able to have some of that information encrypted, and also have those networks of whether it be cars, whether it be cell phones that are on them, different devices. Just thinking here, what is a self-driving car? Well, it's a self-driving, box that you decide to spend some time in. My apartment is a box that I decide to spend some time in. It doesn't have wheels, but that'd be cool. So, what happens if you're suddenly having a place where you live, you definitely want it to be encrypted and more secure. So I think that blockchain technology is better the environment necessary for consent. And the second one is so great at implementing dynamic consent. One of the best examples I found for this one is identity verification. So when I give my identity, let's say to, I want to get to choose, what I share, when, and to who. Let's say I go to a bar, and they ID me. The bar doesn't need to know my exact date of birth. They just need to know I'm above the legal drinking age at that province or that jurisdiction. They don't need to know my sex or gender. They don't need to know the place of issue. They just need to know that it's one that they will accept. And they don't need to know my place of residence. No one needs to know where I live. There's a really great video about consent. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. It's pretty funny. It likens consent to offering someone tea, and it's just really easy and wonderful. So there's a great quote in it. So just because I had tea yesterday doesn't mean I'll want tea today. So that's the notion of it, something being revocable, right? So just because I gave my information to Equifax, 5 years ago, doesn't mean I really want to do it again tomorrow. I should have an easy way of revoking some of that. Again, coming back to what you share, when, and to who. So dynamic consent is revocable and conditional on trust. You can implement conditions on when you share something. So again, kind of that look at those different levels of power. So when those levels are about at the same place, then it's easier to have a transaction that is rooted in trust, in common ground, and a fair amount of compromise on both sides if there needs to be compromise. When the power dynamic is different, then it's more likely, doesn't mean it'll happen, but it's more likely for there to be coercion or something to be fear-based, or someone to not really have a choice. And kind of coming back to just the ID, we all know that our IDs are incredibly valuable, and it's not about to stop being the case. Third part on this, so do you think that it logs express consent in a secure way, or can be doing this? This one's kind of short, so logging express consent in a secure way, the trust is kept because the system architecture requires it to be so. So if you're looking at transactions, if you're looking at Bitcoin and voting on the blockchain, anything tampered with is evident, if it's even possible. And so it means that having access and having management abilities of a system, it does not directly result in being able to tamper with it. So looking again, what do all of those do? Well, the users gain in autonomy, self-determination. There's a more resilient network. It is less dependent on a third party. And it lowers barriers to participation, such as in mesh networks. I won't go all through it, but a little tidbit on respect-based leadership versus fear-based leadership. With more and more, as you go up that chain, or up that pyramid of needs, you get more agency to choose to participate in respect-based leadership. Whether it's as a leader yourself or whether you're doing the following. I'm going to just focus on the respect-based side because the fear-based, well, it's just kind of the opposite. So respect-based leadership being inspiration and motivated, it's actually genuine respect. So when people say, this person has so much respect, well, it's not bad to ask, well, is it actual respect or is it fear? So it's a good thing to have a look at. There is, in respect-based leadership, you rank ideas and methods, whereas you kind of rank people on the fear side of things. Respect-based is creative, not threatened by others, turns attention outward, and encourages autonomy. So I'll just leave off on, so having a look at those transactions or those exchanges that are consent-based. So, you've got one player putting something forward. You've got the second player putting something forward as well, and that's great. That's awesome. But I do think that there's something else that's created in that, and that's the actual transaction itself. That's what I personally call true value. So when there's something that has the environment of being inspiration motivated, you know, all these things that we've seen, I think that that's a new kind of transaction that we're all trying to attain more. And I think that in a grander scheme of things, it's also part of why we want decentralization. So I don't want to, you know, exchange something because I'm afraid, and I'm afraid of the retaliation, and you know, there's a need that needs to get met somewhere else. I want to exchange something because it's what I actually want, and the other person actually wants. And of course, you know, just in terms of damage control, it's never really about if something goes wrong. It's always about, you know, when. We're not fallible. If we start designing systems that acknowledge that and that take that into account, I think we will all be the better for it. Thanks.